So, you know how we usually think about censorship these days, right? It's almost always a digital thing.
Right, yeah, like getting kicked off a platform.
Exactly. You post something controversial, some algorithm flags you, and suddenly, boom, you're locked out of your account. You lose your digital VIP pass, basically.
Yeah, your reach gets throttled, or they just deactivate you completely. It's super frustrating, obviously, but it's stuck behind a screen. Your actual physical life, your ability to, like, walk down the street, totally unchanged.
But what happens when that digital exile suddenly bleeds into the physical world?
Oh, man, that is the question.
Right, like what happens when a debate over a couple of social media posts doesn't just get you blocked by some tech CEO, but actually gets you physically barred from crossing the international borders of allied nations?
It's a massive escalation.
It really is. It bypasses the courtroom entirely. It just manifests as this opaque bureaucratic wall, and it spirals all the way down into this massive existential battle over the actual definition of national identity.
Which is exactly the paradigm shift we're getting into today. We are looking at a worldview that sees the battleground moving from, internet moderation straight into real-world bureaucratic exile.
We have such an incredibly dense, just genuinely fascinating mission for you today on this custom-tailored deep dive. We are looking at an extensive transcript of a panel discussion recorded recently in Hungary.
Yeah, likely at the Danube Institute over there.
Right. And the panel features two really prominent conservative commentators.
Yeah.
You've got Eva Vlardingerbroek, the Dutch political commentator, and Dave Rubin, the American political commentator and host.
Two very big voices on the right.
Huge voices. And we're going to unpack their really sweeping, unapologetic arguments about the future of Western civilization, mass migration, free speech, and this is a big one, the foundational role of theology in maintaining a society.
Yeah, theology plays a massive part in their argument, but hey, we need to pause right here at the very top because we are dealing with some incredibly charged right-wing source material today.
Yep.
So just a quick reminder to you listening, we aren't here to endorse or, condemn what Dave or Eva are saying.
Yeah.
We are strictly here as mechanics.
Just lifting the hood.
Exactly. Lifting the hood on their arguments to see exactly how their political engine works. We are not taking sides. We aren't validating this worldview. Our goal is just to impartially report on the architecture of their arguments exactly as they presented them.
Because whether you agree with them or not, you need to understand the mechanics of a political movement that is rapidly reshaping global elections right now.
You really do.
So I want to dive right into the deep end of this transcript because it starts with something deeply personal that perfectly illustrates this terrifying in their view, leap from digital to physical restriction.
The travel ban.
The travel ban.
Hey.
Eva Vlardingerbroek reveals to the audience that she was formally banned from entering the United Kingdom.
Which is wild for a citizen of a neighboring European country.
Right. Her travel authorization, her ETA, was just unilaterally revoked by the UK government.
And the mechanism of this revocation is really what we need to focus on here. According to Vlardingerbroek, the email she received out of the blue, it didn't have any detailed legal brief.
No crime cited.
No specific indictment at all. The official reason the UK government gave was simply that her presence was, quote, not conducive to the public good.
Not conducive to the public good. I mean, let's just unpack how insanely broad that is.
It's basically a blank check.
Yeah. It's not a legal standard. It sounds like a purely aesthetic judgment. And she points out the timeline, which she clearly views as the smoking gun here.
Oh, the timeline is fascinating.
She tells the audience this revocation happened exactly 3 days after she criticized UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer on X.
Right, specifically regarding his handling of migrant rape gangs.
Yes, and what she perceives as his attacks on freedom of speech. 3 days later, her physical right to enter a neighboring allied nation is just severed.
And notice the shift in state power here. I mean, traditionally in Western democracies, if you crossed a line with your speech like libel, slander, inciting a riot, there was a process.
You'd have a trial.
Exactly. You had a public trial, evidence, a judge, a jury. You had your day in court. But what she's describing is the rise of administrative silencing.
It's an administrative exile.
Yeah. Some opaque government department just drops an email in your inbox revoking your travel rights, and there's no clear avenue for appeal.
It's the weaponization bureaucracy.
Yes.
And it's so much quieter than like a dramatic military crackdown, which to them almost makes it more insidious.
Oh, absolutely.
And Dave Rubin totally validates this atmosphere of fear in the transcript. He talks about this dinner he went to after a conference in London around February of 2025.
Right, the dinner with all the influencers.
Yeah, he's sitting with like 10 highly influential panelists, major American and British public figures, people whose entire, very lucrative careers are built on expressing their opinions.
That's literally their job, taking the heat.
Right. Yet, at this dinner, they all shared this profound, completely novel anxiety. They were actively afraid to tweet their observations about what Rubin described as Hamas rallies happening outside on the streets of London.
Rubin actually notes that he wanted to document what he was seeing, but he consciously held back. He says he wanted to, quote, get out of this country without an international incident.
He even mentioned he needed armed security the whole time he was there.
Yeah, the panel is diagnosing a massive chilling effect here. When you have influential commentators self-censoring in private dining rooms in London because they're terrified of international arrest or getting detained at Heathrow, the panel argues that the foundational Western value of free expression is already critically compromised.
And Rubin points out the utter absurdity of this being a priority for the state. He's like, look at all the massive structural problems the UK is facing.
Stagnant economic growth, crumbling infrastructure.
Right. Crime. And he argues that if using state resources to ban a Dutch conservative commentator is your math equation, your equation is severely broken.
He views it as a government focusing on punishing political dissent because it's totally incapable of solving actual domestic crises.
Which creates this really fascinating structural tension in their argument.
Yeah.
Because if we look at how the state is using administrative friction to silence individual native or allied voices, we have to contrast that with how the panel views the state's treatment of massive, collective, often foreign or immigrant groups.
Oh, this is where the friction really sparks in the transcripts.
Yeah.
We just talked about the bureaucratic silencing of one individual, but the panel is completely aghast at who is actually allowed to dominate the physical public square.
Yeah, they bring up these mass demonstrations. Specifically, they point to thousands of Muslims engaging in coordinated mass public prayer in places like Trafalgar Square in London and Times Square in New York.
The panel is forcing a debate here on the mechanical limits of the right to assembly. Yeah. And Rubin tries to walk this very fine, classical liberal line.
Right, he tries to be careful there.
He does. He states that if someone wants to pray privately or just wander down the street muttering a prayer or go to their local mosque, he has absolutely zero issue with it.
He totally defends that right.
But he argues there is a fundamental qualitative difference between private religious expression and a mass movement deliberately taking over major public utilities and arterial roadways.
I want to test the mechanics of that argument with you. Let's imagine the public square as, like, a shared operating system that a society runs on.
Okay, I like that.
Everyone has a user account, right? You can log in, run your programs, express your code. But if one massive group of users suddenly runs a program that hogs 99% of the CPU, freezing out every other user, at what point does their right to use the system become a denial of service attack on everyone else?
That denial of service analogy perfectly captures Rubin's frustration. He points to pro-Palestinian protesters, who he explicitly and repeatedly labels as pro-Hamas protesters, demonstrating directly outside of synagogues in New York.
Yeah, physically outside the buildings.
Right. And while he acknowledges the technical constitutional right to protest, he argues that the sheer volume, the intimidating frequency, and the highly targeted nature of these mass gatherings effectively negate other citizens' rights to assembly and religious freedom.
Because if Jewish citizens are physically intimidated from entering their places of worship, the shared operating system has essentially crashed.
Exactly. And Eva Vlardingerbroek seizes on this disparity to highlight what she sees as a deep structural betrayal by the state. She brings up the case of Isabel von Spruce.
Oh, that case got so much publicity.
It really did. She's the British woman who was arrested and searched by police for praying silently in her head while standing on a public street outside an abortion clinic in the UK.
Wait, I just want to emphasize that for the listener, she was arrested for silent prayer.
Yeah.
Like literally inside her own mind.
Yes. Invisible, internal prayer. And the juxtaposition they're drawing here is incredibly stark. It's meant to highlight a perceived two-tiered justice system.
Totally. On one hand, you have thousands of people commandeering Trafalgar Square for a public religious demonstration, and the state provides police protection and road closures for them.
And on the other hand, a native citizen is arrested for silent prayer. Vlardingerbroek argues this just exposes a terminal hypocrisy in how modern human rights laws are actually applied.
She goes so far as to claim that human rights treaties have been entirely inverted. They don't protect the citizen from the state anymore.
Right, she thinks they are weaponized against the native populations to limit their freedoms while providing unlimited cover for foreign groups.
And what's interesting is she explicitly refuses to advocate for new, stricter laws to ban these mass protests.
Which you might expect her to do.
Right, but she doesn't. Why? Because she has zero trust in the establishment. She argues that any new restrictive laws aimed at curbing radical protests wouldn't actually be used against those hostile groups. The bureaucracy would just immediately turn those laws around and use them to further crush native conservative dissent.
She's essentially describing the complete collapse of the social contract. The underlying agreement of a liberal democracy is that the rules apply equally to everyone in the shared space.
And Ruin warns that if a government consistently allows groups harboring ideologies that are fundamentally hostile to Western values to dominate the public square, while simultaneously prosecuting native citizens for silent prayer or a tweet.
The societal contract just disintegrates.
So if the shared operating system is crashing, and the administrators, the government, are actively targeting the original users while letting malware run rampant, what is the panel's diagnosis of how we actually got here?
This is where the transcript moves from observing the symptoms to diagnosing the disease, and they dive into arguably the most explosive arguments of the entire discussion.
Shifting demographics and the demand for remigration.
Yes. The panel views the visible, physical transformation of these public spaces, the mass prayers in Trafalgar Square, the protests outside synagogues, not as temporary political anomalies. They see them as the inevitable mathematical result of a massive, unprecedented shift in national demographics.
And they spend a significant amount of time trying to quantify the sheer, staggering scale of this shift.
Dave Rubin throws out some numbers for the U.S., and they are massive. He estimates that under the 4 years of the Biden administration, roughly 15 to 20 million people crossed into the U.S.
15 to 20 million. And he stacks that figure on top of an estimated 12 million undocumented immigrants already present in the country.
And to contextualize why he believes this is an insurmountable crisis, Rubin asks the audience in Hungary a trivia question. He says, does anyone know how many people Donald Trump actually managed to deport through ICE during his first term?
Oh, and the audience shouts out these huge guesses, right? Like 2 million, 3 million?
Yeah, and Rubin corrects him. It was only about 800,000 people.
I really want to pause on that 800,000 number because the audience in the transcript is audibly disappointed by it.
They groan.
Yeah. And Rubin uses this massive delta between 20 million arrivals and 800,000 deportations to pose a really dark logistical hypothetical.
He says, look, even if you take that 20 million and assume that 90% of them are just normal people looking for a better life.
Let's assume only 10% harbor truly anti-Western views, or are engaged in gang violence, or are hostile state actors.
And it's still 2 million people.
And Rubin openly questions the mechanical reality of dealing with that.
Yeah.
He asks if America, let alone Europe, possesses the bureaucratic fortitude, the manpower, and the societal stomach to locate, detain, and remove 2 million hostile actors.
He points out the intense wall-to-wall media backlash Trump faced for conducting relatively minor ICE raids in places like Minnesota.
Right. So his point is, if the system buckled under the pressure of deporting 800,000 over 4 years, how does it physically execute the removal of millions without tearing the country apart?
Exactly. Now, while Rubin approaches this as a massive logistical and national security threat, Eva Vlerdenerbroek takes a much more existential, identitarian stance regarding Europe's demographic shift.
She is entirely blunt about it. She states that Europe was historically, essentially, an entirely white continent, and she argues that based on current birth rates and migration flows, within the span of just 2 generations, native European populations are mathematically on track to become minorities in their own ancestral homelands.
And this brings us squarely into the panel's explicit debate over the Great Replacement theory.
Which is a highly controversial concept. It's widely categorized as a racist conspiracy theory by mainstream media and political scientists.
Right. It posits that native European populations are being deliberately, intentionally replaced by non-European immigrants by a global elite. And the moderator at the Danube Institute directly challenges the panel on this.
He asks, basically, is this a planned, orchestrated reality, or are people just confusing the complex consequences of globalization with a sinister plot?
I find Rubin's answer to this fascinating because he tries to thread a very difficult needle here. He invokes Carl Sagan, stating the scientific principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah, he concedes that he doesn't have proof of a literal minute-by-minute master plan sitting in a binder on a desk in Brussels or Davos.
He doesn't think there's a smoke-filled room where elites are moving pawns on a map, however. He says it feels undeniably, quote, directionally planned.
Directionally planned. He theorizes that the global elite simply see no utility in native working-class populations. They actively despise the concept of sovereign nation-states, and therefore they deliberately facilitate this open-border reality to erode national cohesion.
But Eva's approach to the planned aspect bypasses the need for a binder in Brussels entirely. She uses a really harsh deductive investigative principle, she says. Look at the consequences and infer the motive.
Infer the motive.
Yeah.
She points to the daily realities she sees in Europe, the terror attacks, the unsafe streets, the degradation of public trust, and she asks this rhetorical question.
If the political leaders see these horrific consequences playing out day after day, year after year, and still violently refuse to close the borders, what other logical conclusion can you draw?
Right. If they possess the power to stop it and choose not to, she infers absolute malicious intent from their inaction.
And because she infers malicious intent, her proposed solution is completely unyielding. She completely dismisses the concepts of assimilation or integration.
She believes the sheer volume of migration has rendered those concepts mathematically impossible now.
Exactly. Her ultimate policy demand is remigration.
Remigration.
She argues forcefully that European nations must actively return millions of people to their countries of origin to become culturally homogenous again. Without that strict cultural and ethnic homogeneity, she insists a functioning high-trust social contract is just a pipe dream.
The panel paints this demographic transformation as a purely elite-driven project, forced upon a totally unwilling, captive public. Vlardingerbroek cites polling data claiming that 60 to 80% of citizens in almost every northwestern European country actively oppose mass migration.
She points back to the catalyst moment in 2015 when Angela Merkel unilaterally opened Germany's borders to over 1 million migrants. She notes that the European citizens were never given a referendum on that.
It was a massive civilization-altering decree made without democratic consent.
Yeah.
But I'm struggling to reconcile the mechanics of that argument.
How so?
Well, you have democratic governments whose leaders require votes to stay in power, allegedly enacting sweeping policies that the vast majority of their voting populace actively despises. How does the panel explain that political paradox? How do the elites survive that at the ballot box?
It's a great question, and Vlardingerbroek describes the elite mechanism of control as emotional warfare. She claims the establishment media and political class used highly emotive, sad imagery to manipulate public empathy, while simultaneously weaponizing language against anyone who objected.
Ah, right. So if you dissented, if you expressed a desire to maintain the demographic status quo of your homeland, you were instantly branded a racist, a fascist, or a Nazi.
Exactly. This emotional warfare paralyzed the native population's ability to advocate for their own interests.
But she offers what she considers a glimmer of hope for her movement.
Yeah.
She believes the effectiveness of that emotional warfare is collapsing.
She argues that people have finally stopped caring about being called a racist. The word has been used so frequently against so many normal people expressing basic concerns that the sting is completely worn off.
And because that psychological manipulation is failing, she argues, the establishment is now pivoting to raw administrative force, like the travel bans, the arrests for silent prayer, the alleged spyware on her phone.
She sees a cohesive, deeply hostile elite agenda operating on two main fronts: immigration and abortion. Vlardingerbroek argues that the overarching goal of the bureaucratic class is the deliberate replacement of the native population.
So they actively promote abortion to aggressively lower native birth rates while simultaneously increasing mass migration.
Yep. It creates an environment that is too economically pressured, housing-starved, and physically unsafe for native Europeans to comfortably start large families, which just accelerates the demographic shift.
Okay, so if we accept the panel's premise that the elites are pushing this comprehensive hostile agenda to dismantle the societal structure, it begs the question, what ideological engine is actually driving them? Like, who benefits from tearing down the system?
Which brings us to their deep critique of the political left and what they identify as the Islamo-leftist alliance.
The Islamo-leftist alliance. The panel takes a really critical look at how the political left has rapidly evolved. Interestingly, Vlardingerbroek observes that traditional wokeism, the obsession with hyper-niche identity politics, the debates over 73 genders, the extreme progressive social theories, she thinks that's actually beginning to burn itself out, at least at the grassroots level in Europe.
She points to a major demographic fracture here. She notes that Gen Z boys are vehemently rejecting this progressive ideology. They're reacting against what they see as anti-male hostility, and they're shifting rapidly toward the political right.
Young women, however, remain deeply attached to the progressive framework. But she emphasizes a crucial caveat. While the youth might be tiring of the woke debates, the supranational institutions, specifically the European Union bureaucracy, are still heavily infected by this ideology.
And they are continuing to force it down via top-down legislative mandates.
Now, Dave Rubin agrees that the purely, quote, woke bananas part of the progressive movement is fading in cultural dominance. But he argues it is mutating into a hybrid ideology that is significantly more dangerous.
He observes that the American left has essentially wedded itself to Islamism.
Right. He points to politicians like Assemblyman Zoran Mamdani in New York. Rubin categorizes him as a socialist and actually predicts he'll soon be unmasked as a full communist who is openly aligning with strict orthodox Islamic movements.
Let's test the logic of that alliance, because on its face, it makes absolutely zero sense.
None. Zero. You have ultra-progressive groups. The panel literally uses the real-world example of Queers for Palestine marching arm in arm, shutting down bridges with orthodox, fundamentally conservative religious movements.
Yeah.
Movements that historically, theologically, and legally in the Middle East violently oppose everything the progressive LGBT movement stands for.
Right. So how does a coalition built on such massive internal contradictions hold together?
Rubin argues it is a marriage of sheer convenience, based entirely on a shared singular desire to dismantle the current Western capitalist system.
But he highlights the terrifying vulnerability and naivete of the progressive side of this alliance. He says the progressives rely on the soft underbelly of tolerance in Western society to usher in these bad actors, believing they're just helping marginalized victims.
But Rubin quips, with just this dark precision, that Queers for Palestine is a very different concept than Palestine for queers.
Yeah, that's a sharp line.
He is implying that the absolute millisecond the Islamist faction gains majority power or achieves their goal of dismantling the current system, they will immediately and violently turn on their progressive allies.
He literally makes a grim joke about it. He says the Islamists will push the progressives off the roof first, but luckily there are fewer high roofs left in Gaza. It's a brutal assessment.
And to explain why the left is so susceptible to this suicidal alliance, Dave Rubin offers a bumper sticker political theory. I love this part. He states, liberals need conservatives to guard the door.
Yes, this is a profound piece of political philosophy that underpins this entire deep dive. Rubin identifies heavily with classical liberalism, the philosophy prioritizing extreme individualism, free speech, free markets, and equality under the law.
But he concedes a deeply uncomfortable truth for a liberal. Classical liberalism cannot defend itself.
It just can't. An open society, built entirely on the operating system of infinite tolerance, contains a fatal flaw in its code. It is uniquely vulnerable to bad actors who will use the rules of tolerance to gain power, only to destroy the tolerant society from within once they have it.
Think about it like an open source operating system. The core directive is accept all inputs, tolerate all code. But what happens when someone uploads a malware program whose specific stated function is to delete the operating system?
If your only rule is we tolerate everything, you have to tolerate the malware until it destroys you.
Exactly. Rubin is arguing that classical liberalism is this beautiful, brightly lit room to live in, but it requires rigid, uncompromising, deeply conservative boundaries, a heavy locked door with an armed guard to ensure the room isn't overrun by those who hate the light.
And he laments that modern Democrats have completely abandoned the classical liberal principles of guarding the door. He notes that only a few outliers he mentions, comedian Bill Maher and Senator John Fetterman, still cling to the necessity of boundaries.
The panel explores this civilizational vulnerability through a historical lens, invoking that popular adage. Hard times create good men create soft times create weak men create hard times.
Rubin believes the West is currently suffocating in the soft times created by the good men of the post-World War II era.
Right, we are so distracted by unprecedented modern luxury. Video games, pharmaceutical interventions, iPhones. We have entirely lost the foundational vigilance required to maintain a free society.
We got comfortable, we fired the guards, and we left the door wide open.
And this ideological battle over who guards the door and how fiercely they are willing to guard it isn't just a domestic political dispute. It scales up massively onto the global stage.
Oh, totally. The philosophy of the open door versus the guarded door dictates how these nations engage with the rest of the world, who they fund, and what foreign wars they choose to intervene in.
Which brings us to a fascinating friction point in the transcript regarding supranational power and foreign policy. When it comes to the global stage, the panel exhibits a massive, visceral hatred for supranational organizations, specifically the European Union.
They view these bodies as the ultimate champions of the open door ideology, prioritizing foreign globalist interests over the well-being and security of their own native citizens.
We see this exact dynamic play out in their discussion of the war in Ukraine. Eva Vlaardingerbroek fiercely defends Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, framing him not as an authoritarian, but as the only sensible, morally courageous European leader left.
Why? Because Orban is utilizing his veto power to actively block billions of euros from being funneled by the EU into Ukraine.
She points out that European taxpayers have already sent roughly 200 billion euros to the conflict, and she is absolutely outraged by the prospect of the EU strong-arming member states to send another 90 billion.
She frames the EU's pressure tactics on Orban to release the funds as extreme political blackmail.
And to illustrate the EU's misplaced loyalties, she points to Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. She notes that von der Leyen's official social media banner features a Ukrainian flag.
For Eva, that banner is a deeply insulting symbol of betrayal. She points out a basic geographic and political fact. Ukraine is not a member state of the European Union.
She argues that von der Leyen's public alliances clearly lie with foreign nations and abstract globalist projects, rather than with the European working class whose children and grandchildren will be burdened with paying off these massive war loans for decades.
She views the EU's continuous funding as a deliberate, cynical attempt to drag the bloody conflict on forever. It blocks realistic peace negotiations because the war enriches the military-industrial complex and distracts from domestic failures.
Now, Dave Rubin echoes this deep skepticism from an American perspective. He notes that the Ukraine war, despite the hundreds of billions spent, has essentially fallen off the mainstream media map in the U.S. He calls the entire endeavor an endless boondoggle.
His primary critique is strategic. He argues that no one in the Biden administration or the Pentagon has been able to articulate a clear, definable path to victory.
Right. No one can say exactly how many tanks, how many Patriot missile batteries, and how many billions of dollars are mathematically required to push Russia out of the Donbas and Crimea. Without a defined endpoint, it's just a meat grinder fueled by Western tax dollars.
So when it comes to Ukraine, the panel shares a deeply isolationist, non-interventionist viewpoint. They want money, the military hardware, and the political focus kept strictly at home to guard their own borders.
But, and this is where the transcript gives you absolute ideological whiplash, when the topic of conversation shifts from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, specifically Iran. Dave Rubin instantaneously transforms from a cautious isolationist into a highly enthusiastic, aggressive interventionist.
The timeline of the transcript is crucial here to understand the context. The panel discussion is operating under a hypothetical or perhaps a recently occurred reality in their 2026 timeline, where Donald Trump has returned to the presidency and has engaged in a rapid, massive joint military campaign alongside Israel against Iran.
Right. The moderator sets the stage for the panel, describing a scenario where America has supposedly fired 5,000 missiles into Iran at a staggering cost of $16 billion.
And rather than critiquing the cost or the intervention, Dave Rubin couldn't be more thrilled about it.
He claims that in a span of just 20 days, the U.S. military completely and surgically decapitated the Iranian regime. He boasts that they sank the Iranian Navy, achieved total air supremacy by obliterating their air force, and entirely wiped out their deeply entrenched ballistic missile and nuclear development programs. But I have to stop and ask, how does he reconcile this? How do you furiously condemn spending money to defend Ukraine's borders from an invasion, calling it a boondoggle, but then turn around and celebrate spending $16 billion in 3 weeks to preemptively blow up Iran's military infrastructure? It seems entirely contradictory.
Rubin addresses this contradiction directly, attempting to square this massive military intervention with the populist right's pledge to end forever wars. His argument hinges on efficiency and threat assessment.
Okay, write that down.
He argues that 20 days of overwhelming, miraculously precise military force that successfully destroys a regime sponsoring global terrorism is the exact opposite of a forever war. So he views the decades-long occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan as failures, but sees this hypothetical Iran campaign as a necessary surgical strike to fundamentally rewrite the geopolitical map, cutting off the head of the snake and allowing for new, sustainable peace deals in the Middle East.
It all comes down to their threat matrix. They do not view Vladimir Putin's Russia as an existential ideological threat to the cultural fabric or the operating system of the West. They view Russia as a regional power having a border dispute.
But they view Iran, as the world's largest state sponsor of radical Islamic terrorism, as the root progenitor of the ideological and demographic threats, the malware that is currently infiltrating their home countries through mass migration and ideological subversion on college campuses.
Exactly. Eva Vlardingerbroek completely agrees with Rubin's threat assessment regarding Iran, noting that whenever the Middle East is destabilized by Iranian proxies, it historically causes massive destabilizing waves of migration directly into Europe. But true to her core ideology, she quickly pivots the focus back to national sovereignty. She argues that no matter how much turmoil or warfare is happening in the Middle East, it fundamentally wouldn't matter to the daily lives of Europeans if their leaders simply possess the political will to keep the borders shut.
She refuses to be distracted by the allure of foreign wars. Her message is essentially, let America play global policeman if they want to, let them blow up Iran's navy, but Europe's absolute singular priority must be securing its own borders.
She expresses a deep structural frustration that European citizens have zero democratic mechanisms to vote out unaccountable bureaucrats like Ursula von der Leyen. You cannot vote out people you never voted in.
This leads her to express a desperate hope that a strong, aggressive U.S. administration under Trump will exert enough severe political and economic pressure to force the EU bureaucrats to back down from their globalist agenda.
But as we dig deeper into the philosophical core of the transcript, we realize that for this panel, all of these political policies, whether it's closing borders, deporting millions of people, criticizing the EU, or bombing Iran, are merely treating the symptoms.
Right. They believe they have identified the absolute root cause of the West's civilizational decline. And it isn't just a matter of bad border policy or weak politicians. The root cause, they argue, is a profound, expanding spiritual void.
This brings us to the theological foundation of their entire worldview. Can the West survive without God?
This is where the panel strips away all the modern political jargon, the polling data, the foreign policy debates, and gets down to the bedrock of how they view human nature.
They argue unequivocally that the rapid, near-total absence of Christianity in public life has completely dissolved the moral and philosophical foundation of Western society.
The moderator introduces historian Tom Holland's seminal book, Dominion, into the discussion. Holland's thesis, which the panel adopts, is that even our most fiercely secular, progressive modern values, the concepts of universal human rights, equality, caring for the weak and marginalized, the inherent dignity of the individual, they are not universal human defaults.
They are deeply, exclusively inherited Christian concepts.
Right. The text suggests that modern wokeism or progressivism is essentially a warped, mutated, zombie form of Christianity. It retains the Christian impulse to protect the victim, but it has completely stripped away the divine authority, the demand for personal virtue, and the concept of forgiveness.
Let's look at this through the lens of our operating system analogy. The panel is arguing that the fundamental source code of Western civilization, the kernel that allows all programs of free speech, human rights, and democracy to run, is the Christian mythos and moral framework.
They are posing a terrifying question. Can a society continue to run those programs if you delete the source code? Can secular ethics survive without the theological mythos that birthed them? Or does the system inevitably crash under the weight of its own contradictions?
Eva Vlardingerbroek, who knows that she is a recent Catholic convert, argues emphatically that the system is already crashing. She states that the moment a society discards the absolute, objective moral truth of Jesus Christ, it immediately and unavoidably descends into moral relativism.
The overarching societal attitude devolves into you have your truth and I have my truth, reducing all morality to mere personal preference.
And why is relativism so existentially dangerous in her eyes? Because she believes fundamentally that human beings are deeply flawed and completely incapable of handling the moral vacuum of deciding their own truths.
If we depose God and pretend we are gods ourselves, deciding arbitrarily what is right and wrong based on the cultural winds of the decade, She argues it creates the perfect, fertile breeding ground for dictators, bureaucrats, and bad actors to force their version of reality down our throats using state power.
She draws a direct, uncompromising line from this loss of absolute divine truth to the modern social issues she most deeply despises. She argues that it is exactly this unchecked relativism that allows society to accept concepts like gender ideology, the idea that biological realities can be altered by internal feelings, and the widespread acceptance of abortion.
Without a divine anchor holding reality in place, human whims take over. And in her theological view, untethered human whims inevitably trend toward darkness and evil.
Now, Dave Rubin approaches this from a slightly different angle, which makes their agreement so compelling. He comes from a completely different religious background. He states clearly that he is Jewish, yet he agrees with their premise entirely, arriving at the same conclusion from a secular, historical, and constitutional perspective.
He points out to the European audience that the American founding fathers did not root the Bill of Rights in arbitrary government decrees or the benevolence of a king. They explicitly, deliberately enshrine them as God-given rights.
Rubin references a famous, ongoing intellectual debate between the psychologist Jordan Peterson and the atheist neuroscientist Sam Harris. The debate centers on a historical question. Did the incredible flourishing of the Western world, the scientific revolution, the expansion of human rights, the abolition of slavery come purely from the rational, secular Enlightenment?
Or did centuries of deep, dogmatic religious texts and beliefs create the necessary, stable moral foundation that allowed the Enlightenment to even happen?
And Rubin asserts that the historical record undeniably proves the latter. Without the religious foundation establishing the inherent value of the individual, the expansion of true classical liberalism is impossible.
Eva actually takes it a step further, joking darkly that the Enlightenment is where it all went wrong. She's pointing out the inherent danger of elevating pure rationality, freedom, and equality as the only supreme values untethered from a higher, transcendent moral truth to guide them.
This deep theological focus creates some incredibly intense, highly revealing interactions with the audience in Hungary. A woman who identifies herself as a Coptic Orthodox Christian, originally from Egypt, stands up to address the panel.
Yeah, she speaks with deep emotion about the severe, ongoing persecution of ancient Christian communities in the Middle East, in places like Gaza, Syria, Iraq, and Sudan.
She specifically references the horrific slaughter of 20 Egyptian Coptic martyrs on a beach in Libya by ISIS in 2015, men who were beheaded for refusing to renounce their faith. She pleads to know if the fate of these persecuted, dying Christian communities is even remotely on the minds of high-level Western political leaders.
Rubin's response to her is stark, devoid of any comforting political spin. He tells her plainly that no, the survival of Middle Eastern Christians is absolutely not top of mind for Western leaders.
But he goes further. He uses the devastation and subjugation of the Coptic community in Egypt as a direct, terrifying historical warning to Europe. He explicitly states that if a nation imports large populations of people who adhere to an ideology that inherently seeks to subjugate or dominate other faiths, the math is inevitable. They will ultimately force you to leave, or they will kill you.
The moderator chimes in during this exchange to heavily praise their host country of Hungary. He notes that Hungary is unique among Western nations for operating a specific Hungary Helps program, an initiative dedicated entirely to providing financial and logistical aid to persecuted Christian communities globally.
This highlights the panel's overarching theme, that Viktor Orban's Hungary is perhaps the last remaining bastion of true, unashamed Western Christian values.
And then we get another incredible audience question that tests the absolute extreme limits of Eva's identitarian worldview.
A man from Slovakia stands up and asks her a highly specific, direct, hypothetical question regarding assimilation. He asks, if a genuine, well-meaning person from Oman wants to move to the Netherlands, respects the laws, and genuinely desires to become a Dutchman, what would it take for her to accept him as fully Dutch?
Vladimir-Brooks' answer is a masterclass in the philosophical framework of the new right-wing populist movement. She completely severs the concept of civic integration from the concept of ethnic identity.
She uses her own life as the primary example. She is married to an Italian man and resides in Italy. She tells the audience she speaks the Italian language, understands and respects the culture, shares the dominant Catholic religion, and considers herself fully integrated into Italian society.
But she insists with absolute certainty she is not Italian. She remains ethnically and intrinsically Dutch.
She says to the crowd, I have ethnically Dutch ancestry for as long as you could probably go back. Therefore, Her answer to the hypothetical man from Oman is essentially this. You can immigrate legally, you can adapt perfectly to the culture, you can be a tremendous economic and social benefit to the host land, and you absolutely should be treated with respect and dignity under the law.
But ethnically, ancestrally, you will forever remain distinct. You will not be a Dutchman in the ancestral sense of the word.
She is arguing that you cannot magically, legislatively separate ethnicity from national identity, especially not when dealing with the mass numbers of migrants currently entering Europe. She fundamentally believes that native European ethnic groups have an ancestral, inviolable right to remain the demographic and cultural majority in their own historical lands.
Rubin jumps in to rescue the moment with a much blunter, highly pragmatic American political answer to the Omani question. He simply says, not right now.
Yeah. He argues that Western countries are currently buckling under so many massive internal crises that they cannot even afford to entertain the philosophical luxury of debating individual integration at this moment. The doors simply must close.
Okay, so up to this point, we've established that this panel has a fiercely united, cohesive worldview. They agree entirely on the existential threat of demographics, they agree on the utter failure and mutation of the political left, and they absolutely agree on the fundamental theological necessity of God to save the operating system of the West.
But, and this is where we see the cracks in the armor, even with all that massive foundational agreement, this populist movement still splinters heavily when it comes to policing its own boundaries, particularly regarding foreign alliances and accusations of anti-Semitism.
The catalyst for this internal fracture is, once again, a call from the crowd. A man stands up, proudly identifies himself as an independent thinker, and challenges Rubin. He asks why anyone who dares to question the actions or the influence of the State of Israel is automatically, reflexively labeled an anti-Semite.
And to ground his question, he specifically brings up the massive conservative commentator Tucker Carlson, attempting to defend Carlson against recent charges of anti-Semitism.
Dave Rubin's reaction is instantaneous, visceral, and incredibly aggressive. He pushes back hard on the premise of the question. He tells the man that ordinary people criticize the geopolitical actions of the Israeli government all the time without being called anti-Semitic.
Right. He points out that there is an entire highly lucrative cottage industry of podcasters and writers making a fortune doing nothing but criticizing Israel daily. But he draws a massive, bright red, uncrossable line at Tucker Carlson.
Rubin accuses Carlson of engaging in deliberate, highly sophisticated verbal trickery. He dissects Carlson's recent rhetoric to expose what he sees as a malicious shell game. Rubin points out that Carlson attacks Israel from two completely contradictory angles to maximize the damage.
On one hand, Carlson critiques Israel for being a purely secular state, heavily implying that a secular geopolitical entity has no biblical or divine right to occupy the Holy Land.
On the other hand, Rubin notes that Carlson recently compared Shabbat, a highly visible Orthodox Jewish outreach movement, to a radical Islamic terrorist organization plotting to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque to start a holy war.
Rubin views this as incredibly dangerous, deliberate incitement. He also specifically brings up a bizarre incident where Tucker Carlson traveled to Israel, but then allegedly refused to get off his plane, essentially boycotting the country from the tarmac.
He then notes that Carlson asked Mike Huckabee, a prominent evangelical Christian, why Israelis shouldn't be forced to take DNA tests to physically prove their ancestral right to inhabit the land.
Rubin clearly, unequivocally categorizes this specific rhetoric, not as foreign policy critique, but as veering into actual historical anti-Semitism, dismissing it angrily as conspiratorial nonsense.
But the truly fascinating moment of the transcript happens right here. Eva Vlardingerbroek immediately steps in to defend Tucker Carlson against Rubin's blistering attack.
This is a massive moment of internal coalition friction playing out on stage.
She doesn't attempt to defend Carlson's specific comments regarding Israel or DNA tests. In fact, she admits she focuses her commentary primarily on Europe and intentionally avoids the radioactive complexities of the Middle East debate. Her defense of Carlson is rooted entirely in personal loyalty and his overarching, undeniable contribution to the conservative movement globally.
She tells Rubin and the audience, I think loyalty is something that is incredibly important in my personal life, so you will never hear me say anything bad about him. She credits Carlson with doing incredible, vital work for the populist movement in America, acting as a massive battering ram against the establishment.
She then masterfully pivots the conversation away from the specifics of Carlson's rhetoric and back to her broader European thesis. She states that she is simultaneously smeared as a Zionist and an anti-Semite by the media all the time, but she notes that the actual physical, rampant anti-Semitism she sees exploding on the streets of Europe comes predominantly from the massive, newly imported immigrant populations, not from conservative commentators like Tucker Carlson.
This tense exchange reveals the complex mechanics of how this political movement operates. You have a massive coalition that prides itself on absolute free speech absolutism, on gleefully destroying the establishment's censorship protocols, and on allowing a wild diversity of heterodox thought.
Yet they're violently forced to grapple with how to police their own boundaries when a prominent allied figure's rhetoric crosses a line that one faction of the coalition deems existentially dangerous or bigoted.
Why is policing this boundary so important? Because if a movement dedicated to guarding the door of Western civilization allows actual bigotry into the room, it destroys its own moral legitimacy.
Exactly. Rubin tries to clarify his stance on free speech in this context. He explicitly says he does not want Tucker Carlson kicked off YouTube or banned from X. He fully supports Carlson's First Amendment right to spout what Rubin considers dangerous nonsense.
But Rubin fiercely reserves his own free speech right to aggressively publicly call it out and condemn it. It is a messy, live-fire exercise in how populist political coalitions attempt to hold together when they fundamentally, deeply disagree on highly inflammatory geopolitical issues.
It perfectly demonstrates that while the right-wing populist movement is fiercely unified in its opposition to the supranational elite, mass migration, and progressive social policies, it is still deeply fractured on what the actual positive vision for global alliances and internal policing looks like.
Which brings us to the end of our incredibly dense, wide-ranging journey today. Let's do a quick recap to pull all these disparate threads into a single narrative. We started by examining the chilling new reality of bureaucratic exile. Eva Vlardingbroek being banned from the UK via a single email for a tweet, signaling a terrifying shift from digital moderation to geopolitical borders being weaponized against political speech.
We then move from the individual to the collective, exploring the panel's argument that public spaces are being overwhelmed by hostile mass movements. This fractures the social contract, exposing what they see as a dual-tiered justice system that actively penalizes native citizens while providing endless cover for foreign groups.
From there, we dove into the stark mathematics of their demographic anxieties. We unpacked the panel's belief that elites are purposefully replacing native populations, leading Eva to demand the extreme logistical solution of mass remigration. We analyzed their critique of the political left mutating into an unstable Islamo-leftist alliance, and their deep frustration with supranational powers like the EU funding endless wars in Ukraine while deliberately ignoring the collapse of their own borders at home.
And we anchored all of these political and demographic arguments in their ultimate theological bedrock. The belief that without the absolute objective moral truth of Christianity, society inevitably devolves into a dangerous relativism where humans attempt to play God, leading mathematically to civilizational collapse.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, and I want to remind you, the listener, why we took the time to do this deep dive, regardless of your personal political leanings or whether you vehemently disagree with every single word Dave Rubin and Eva Vlardingbroek said.
These arguments, these exact frameworks of demographic anxiety, elite betrayal, and the demand for cultural homogeneity are not fringe internet theories relegated to dark corners of the web anymore.
They have breached the mainstream. They are the central driving arguments gaining massive, undeniable traction in both American and European elections right now. They are toppling incumbent governments and reshaping legacy political parties. To be a truly well-informed citizen, to be able to decipher the deeper currents beneath the chaotic daily news cycle, you have to understand the architecture of these viewpoints. You cannot effectively debate or engage with a political engine if you don't understand how its parts move together.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on. Let's circle all the way back to Dave Rubin's core philosophical theory. Liberals need conservatives to guard the door. He argued beautifully that classical liberalism, the open-source operating system of free speech, tolerance, and movement, requires a rigid conservative guard to protect it from malware, extreme progressives, and bad actors who would exploit its tolerance.
But here is the paradox we leave you to wrestle with. If the ultimate solution to saving Western civilization requires initiating massive, forced remigration of millions of people, closing down national borders, enforcing strict cultural homogeneity, and aggressively policing the ideological purity of the public square, does the act of fiercely guarding the door eventually destroy the very liberal freedoms of speech, movement, and tolerance that the door was built to protect in the first place? If you militarize the operating system to save it from malware, does it just become a prison? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.